Part 1. A Nation Without a State. The Kurdish Story in Syria. For more than a century, the Kurdish people have been the world's largest ethnic group without an independent state. Scattered across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and the Kurds. Scattered across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, the Kurds have repeatedly found themselves at the center of regional conflicts despite never fully controlling their own destiny. Among these countries, Syria presents one of the most complex chapters of Kurdish history, a story shaped by colonial borders, shifting alliances, civil power, and greater power rivalry. The Kurdish presence in Syria predates the creation of the modern Syrian state. Kurdish tribes have lived in northern Syria for centuries, particularly along the fertile plains bordering present-day Turkey and Iraq. However, the modern Kurdish population expanded significantly after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following the First World War. As new borders divided the Middle East under British and French mandates, many Kurdish families found themselves separated by newly drawn frontiers. Others fled repression and military campaigns in the newly established Republic of Turkey during the 1920s and 1930s, settling in what was then French-controlled Syria. Unlike neighboring Iraq, where the Kurds inhabited a continuous mountainous region, Syria's Kurdish population was concentrated in three geographically separated areas. The northeastern Jazira region around the Kamishli and Al-Hasakah, the central border town of Kobani, and the northwestern enclave of Afrin. These regions were divided by large Arab-majority territories, making political unity far more difficult. For decades, Syria's Kurds remained a politically marginalized minority. Successive governments in Damascus viewed Kurdish nationalism with suspicion, fearing that demands for cultural recognition or regional autonomy could threaten the country's territorial integrity. These tensions could define Kurdish state relations for generations and lay the foundation for one of the most consequential political transformations of the Syrian civil war. Part 2. Decades of marginalization and the rise of Kurdish identity. When Syria gained independence in 1946, the country's leaders sought to build a unified Arab nation-state. This vision became stronger after the rise of Arab nationalism and the eventual rule of the Ba'ath Party in 1963. Within this political framework, the Kurds were not recognized as a distinct national community but were instead expected to assimilate into an Arab-dominated state. The turning point came in 1962 when the Syrian government conducted a controversial special consensus in Al-Hasakah province. Tens of thousands of Kurds were stripped of their Syrian citizenships after authorities claimed they had entered the country illegally from Turkey. Many families who had lived in the region for generations suddenly became stateless. Without citizenship, they could not legally own property, vote, work in many government jobs, or obtain passports. Over time, the number of stateless Kurds grew into the hundreds of thousands as children inherited their parents' legal status. Government policies extended beyond citizenship. The public use of the Kurdish language faced restrictions. Kurdish cultural celebrations were often monitored or limited, and political organizations advocating Kurdish rights were frequently banned. In the 1970s, Damascus also implemented the Arab Belt Project, settling Arab families along parts of the Turkish border in an effort to alter the demographic balance in traditionally Kurdish areas. Kurdish leaders viewed the policy as an attempt to weaken their historic presence and reduce the possibility of future territorial claims. Despite these pressures, Kurdish identity didn't disappear. Instead, it evolved through underground political parties, cultural networks, and cross-border connections with Kurdish communities in Iraq and Turkey. While open political activism remained dangerous, the sense of belonging to a broader Kurdish nation continued to grow. By the early 20th century, Syrian Kurds had developed organized political movements and local leadership structures that would become critically important when the Syrian state began to lose control during the civil war. Everything changed in 2011 as nationwide protests escalated into armed conflict. The weakening authority of Damascus created a power vacuum across northern Syria. For the first time in modern history, Syrian Kurds would have the opportunity to govern much of their territory. Part 3. Civil War and the Birth of the Kurdish Self-Rule. The outbreak of the Syrian Civil War in 2011 transformed the country's political landscape. What began as protests against the government rapidly evolved into a multi-sided conflict involving rebel groups, Islamist organizations, foreign militaries, and regional powers. As the Syrian government concentrated its forces around major cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs, it reduced its military presence in much of the Kurdish north. By 2012, the Kurdish political organizations had begun filling the resulting vacuum. The most influential was the Democratic Union Party (PYD), supported by its military wing, and the People's Protection Units (YPG). Rather than joining either the Syrian government or the mainstream Arab opposition, Kurdish leaders focused on securing their own communities and building local administrative institutions. Courts, police forces, schools, and municipal councils gradually emerged under Kurdish led administration. The new governing model emphasized local self administration rather than immediate declaration of independence. Kurdish officials argued that they sought a decentralized Syria in which different ethnic and religious communities could govern many of their own affairs while remaining part of the Syrian state. This political experiment later became known internally as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, often referred to as the Rojava. The administration was never exclusively Kurdish. The territories under its control largely included Arab populations along with Azerians, Armenians, Turkmen, Yazidis, and other minority communities. Kurdish authorities attempted to create governing institutions that included representatives from these groups. Although critics questioned how much real political influence non-Kurdish communities possessed, the region remained ethnically diverse, making governance considerably more complex than in neighboring Iraqi Kurdistan. The greatest challenge soon arrived in the form of the Islamic State. Beginning in 2013, ISIS captured vast areas of eastern Syria and northern Iraq, declaring a self-proclaimed caliphate. The Kurdish-controlled territories suddenly found themselves on the front line of one of the most brutal conflicts of the 21st century. The struggle against ISIS would not only determine the survival of Syrian Kurdish administration but would also reshape its relationship with the United States, Turkey, Russia, and the wider international community. Part 4: The Battle Against ISIS and the Quds Global Recognition. By 2014, the rapid expansion of the Islamic State had shocked the world. Entire Iraqi divisions collapsed. Major cities fell within days. ISIS declared a caliphate stretching across large parts of Iraq and Syria. In northern Syria, one small Kurdish town suddenly became the center of the global attention. Kobani. ISIS surrounded Kobani from three sides and launched massive offensive, expecting a quick victory. Instead, Kurdish fighters of the YPG and Women Protection Units (YPJ) mounted a determined defense. Street by street, house by house, they resisted despite being heavily outgunned. Images of the battle spread worldwide, turning Kobani into a symbol of resistance against ISIS. The United States, which had begun an international campaign against ISIS, recognized that Kurdish forces were among the most effective local partners on the ground. American-led coalition aircraft carried out intensive strikes against ISIS positions around Kobani, helping Kurdish defenders gradually push the group back. After months of fierce fighting, ISIS was forced to retreat. The victory marked one of the organization's first major battlefield defeats, demonstrated that it could be stopped. Following Kobani, operation between Kurdish forces and the United States expanded significantly to include Arab, Assyrian, and other local fighters. The Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) were established in 2015. Although the YPG remained its strongest component, the SDF presented itself as a broader, multi-ethnic coalition. With American air support, intelligence, training, and special forces assistance, the SDF steadily advanced across northeastern Syria. Over the following years, the SDF captured key ISIS strongholds, including Manbij, Tabqa, and eventually Raqqa, the de facto capital of the Islamic State in Syria. The final territorial enclave of ISIS at Baghuz fell in 2019, effectively ending the group's control over populated territory. While ISIS continued to operate as an insurgency, its self-proclaimed caliphate had collapsed. These victories dramatically increased the international profile of Syria's Kurdish-led forces. However, military success also brought new geopolitical challenges. Turkey viewed the YPG as closely linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party (PKK), an organization Ankara designates as a terrorist group. As Kurdish controlled territory expanded along the Turkish border, Ankara concluded that it faced an emerging security threat. The defeat of ISIS therefore didn't bring lasting stability, it marked the beginning of a new phase of conflict centered on the future of Kurdish self rule in Syria. Part 5. Turkish invention, Turkey's intervention, and the uncertain future of Syrian Kurdistan. For Turkey, the rise of Kurd self rule in North Syria represented For Turkey, the rise of Kurdish self rule in northern Syria represented far more than local development. Ankara viewed the YPG as an extension of the Kurdish Workers' Party (PKK), which has fought an insurgency against the Turkish state since the 1980s. Turkish Turkish leaders found Turkish leaders argued that allowing a YPG-controlled region to consolidate along hundreds of kilometers of the border would create a long-term security threat. Kurdish officials rejected this characterization, insisting that their administration was forced on governing northeastern Syria rather than attacking Turkey. Beginning in 2016, Turkey launched a series of cross-border military operations into northern Syria. Operation Euphrates Shield prevented Kurdish-controlled territories from linking together west of the Euphrates River. In 2018, Kurdish forces and allied Syrian armed groups captured Afrin after weeks of fighting, ending years of Kurdish administration there. Thousands of Kurdish civilians fled the region while new populations moved into areas under Turkish-backed control. The most significant shift came in 2019 when the United States announced the withdrawal of some of its forces from the parts of northern Syria. Turkey quickly launched another offensive, capturing additional territory along the border. Facing military pressure on multiple fronts, the Kurdish-led administration reached a limited agreement with the Syrian government and Russia, allowing the Syrian government troops to return to several border areas for the first time in years. This illustrated the complex reality of the conflict. Former adversaries could become temporary partners when strategic circumstances changed. Today, northern Syria remains under the administration of the Syrian Democratic Forces and the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, supported by a limited US military presence focused on preventing an ISIS resurgence. However, the region's future remains uncertain. Damascus continues to reject permanent autonomy. Turkey maintains military positions inside northern Syria. Russia seeks to expand its influence. Iran supports the Syrian government, and ISIS cells remain active in parts of the desert. The story of Syria's Kurds is therefore still unfinished. Over little more than a decade, they transformed from a politically marginalized minority into one of the most influential military and political actors in the Syrian conflict. Yet they continue to face unresolved questions about sovereignty, security, international recognition, and relations with both neighboring states and the government in Damascus. Whether the Kurdish experiment is self-administered, evolves into a lasting political settlement, or is shaped by future regional agreements will remain one of the most defining questions of Syria's post-war future.